So good morning. It's a lovely morning in Calcutta. Wonderful weather. I've come from Delhi. The weather is not that wonderful there at all. So it's a pleasure to be here. Now, I'll be talking about quirky tales about animals from Indian history. Um, can we have the slide? Yeah. Okay. Can everybody hear me right at the back? Okay, great. So now I've written these books. I don't know how many of you have read them. History of India for Children. So tell me, how many of you like history? Okay, we see a few hands up. How many of you like stories? Yeah, everybody has their hands up, right? Everybody likes stories. Have you ever thought about the word history? What is history? The word story is there as part of history, right? So do you think it should be his story or her story? Or maybe our story, right? So history is basically, it is a series of stories, and it you have to learn to love it by reading these fun, there's so many books now available with the fun aspect of history, and that's the only way really to connect and to learn. Now I'm going to talk about Indian yeah, it's not clicking. Yeah, can you change the slide? This clicker doesn't seem to be working. Yeah, okay. So imagine what India was like, um, you know, 60 million years ago, 65 million years ago. So India was a island which was part in the Indian Ocean, and it came and attached itself to the uh, Asian mainland, right? And how many years ago did the dinosaurs die off? Any answers? Yeah? 65 million years ago, right? At which point India was still an island, it was not attached. What part of India is the original part, which is the old part of India? Does anybody know what part of India existed since maybe 100 million years? It's the Deccan Plateau, essentially, not the Indo-Gangetic Plain, not where we are now. This is more recent. This has been formed after 50 million years ago. So, in when people in India would dig, they would find bones, right? Anywhere, because dinosaurs were there all over the world. When people would dig all over the world, they would find bones. And what do human beings do when they come across some kind of something? They make up stories about what it could possibly be, because those bones didn't resemble anything they knew. There was no animal living which had bones of that size. So in Europe, they created mythical creatures which could possibly explain these bones. Any guesses? What, no, what would resemble, say, a large reptile? Yeah? Dragons, right? And in China also you have dragons. Have you ever wondered why you have this concept of dragons across cultures and mythologies? In India also, in our mythology, we have these mythical large reptiles. Any idea what is the term we use in our mythology? Kids? Indian mythology, large reptiles. Okay, these are the Nagas. You have Sheshnag and Vasuki Nag. So a lot of this mythical thing will come from some kind of actual stimulus. Now, there are Indian scientists have found at least 25 types of distinct dinosaurs which have been there found so far only in India. And this is one of the most famous ones, Rajasaurus narmadensis. Um, so what does it resemble? Any dinosaur you know that it resembles? T-Rex? So they say that it was slightly smaller than a T-Rex, but more ferocious. Um, you have, and scientists have been having fun naming them. There is an Indian dinosaur called Barapausaurus, as in not Vada Pav, but like Bigfoot. So this is something you can look up. Uh, Actually, the word dinosaur, people started thinking of them as ancient creatures after some digs in Jabalpur. in the 1820s. So India has a great connection with the discovery of dinosaurs and with uh, the nomenclature and understanding dinosaurs. Now, another bird, another famous bird evolved in India when it was still an island. And when it docked into mainland Asia, it spread out into Asia and Africa. And it is now extinct in India, but it's still there in Africa. Any guesses what bird I'm talking about? It, yeah, I can hear that. Somebody, yeah, louder. Ostriches. So ostriches have actually evolved in India and spread out to the rest of the world. Yeah, can you change the slide? This changer doesn't seem, yeah. So we know that because uh, in digs across Maharashtra and in the Deccan, they have found jewelry made of ostrich eggshells, which are about 30,000 to 40,000 years old. So humans and ostriches used to coexist in India. And there are these very famous caves in Madhya Pradesh which have prehistoric art. Does anybody know which are the caves? Bhimbetka caves, right? Um, they actually have some of the oldest human art because they found some kind of little scoop kind of uh, engravings which are supposed to be 50,000 years old. So it is considered the oldest human art in the world. They've also found drawings there of ostriches in Bhimbetka caves. And they've also found drawings of giraffes. So did you know that India used to have giraffes? It used to have hippopotamus, and they've all gone extinct over time. Uh, now, try and imagine what India used to be like, say, uh, 4,000 years ago, or even 2,000 years ago. It was a giant forest, especially the Indo-Gangetic plain, where we are, even Delhi, all of Uttar Pradesh, Punjab. Alexander's soldiers, when they came, you have descriptions about how it was a giant forest with each tree requiring 4 people to encircle it, 4 people holding hands. Now, humans came. In the Vedas, it is written that our people went east with fire leading the way. How did they clear the space? How did the humans clear the space when you have to make a little space for living and agriculture? You burn it. So it's also written that Agni shaves the earth like a barber a beard. They would clear up the space and they would live there. Uh, and if you had to go between one place to the other, you would have to go through forests. And animals used to be very much part of your life, which is, I mean, this is a very well-educated audience, as I can see. But name me a book written about teaching people about how to run governments using animal stories, which was there in one of our ancient books. Kids? No, no, an ancient Sanskrit text about animals, but it's actually teaching you governance. And I can safely say most of you would have read it. The Panchatantra, right? So you see, the animals, we knew the animals very well because basically the minute you stepped out of your house, within 500 yards, you would probably be at the forest. Imagine that India, hamlets scattered all over, surrounded by forest. Now, what implication did it have for our food habits? See, today, if you eat animals, I'm vegetarian, but for the people who eat meat, basically you eat meat which has been farmed, right? There's a farmer, he has some goats or pigs or whatever, ducks, chicken, and you eat those animals. For fish, the farming is much less. People, because there are wild spaces, so to say, rivers or oceans, people are going out into the wild. They catch the seafood or fish and they get it and they sell it in the market. For animals, that's not possible because the wild spaces are very few. But in ancient India, you had huge wild spaces where animals were there, the forests, right? So mostly people didn't bother to farm animals. They would go out, you'd have a professional, the way you have professional fishermen, you would have professional hunters, and they would go out and catch animals and birds and sell them in the market for food. Now that had a India has a huge variety of animal and plant life, right? What's the term we use for a space which has a huge variety of life? Biodiverse, right? That's the word. So we are extremely biodiverse. In Bharatpur, they did a count of the birds, and there are 400 varieties of birds. But when you farm animals, you may farm 5 varieties, 10 varieties, 15 varieties. The diversity available in a forest is far more than what you would. So that had now, yeah, can you change the slide? These are some of the things we used to eat in ancient India. As part of normal food, these were not exceptional. The Vedas have talked about, can you see the pictures? Turtles, porcupines, monitor lizards, crocodiles. If you, in the Vedas, they have mentioned 50 varieties of animals which are okay for sacrifice, hence eating. Charak, any of you know who Charak was? Charak was an ancient Indian physician who has written a book called Charak Samhita. A lot of Ayurveda comes from it, but he was basically a doctor. He has mentioned 80 varieties of animal which he thinks are okay for eating. And one of the most nutritious things he's mentioned for giving strength, he's given a recipe for a large omelette of crocodile eggs mixed with rice flour and made in ghee. So this is something to think about, because this is coming out of the very fact that you're surrounded by forest. There is a huge variety. When the hunter goes out to catch a bird, and there are 200 varieties of birds, he's not going to restrict himself to one or two, right? He's going to catch whatever he catches. How many of you have read that Jatak tale about Indra drawing on the moon, you know, the rabbit story? Yeah? So in that, you have all these animals who are giving their food to the hunter. So in that, the jackal has actually raided a household, and he has uh, uh, stolen a grilled lizard, which is what he gives to the hunter. So this is part of our Jatak tales, and this was not, I mean, okay, the main meat may still have been deer or goat, but this was as much part of your food. The way you have a huge variety of fish and seafood, you would see this same variety in thing. Now, can you change the slide? Yeah. So what is this animal? Dingo. So I'm going to talk about everybody's favorite animal now, which is the dog. When the Europeans first came to Australia in the late 1700s, they found that all the mammals there were different from the kind of mammals they had seen in Europe or Asia. Any idea what's the term we use for the kind of mammals found in Australia? Marsupials, right? But they only found 2 mammals which looked familiar to them. One was this Australian wild dog called a dingo, which was the other mammal. Okay, this is a bit of a trick question. Which was the other mammal that looked familiar to them? No, platypus was not. Yeah? Actually, I shouldn't do this. Man. Okay. So men are mammals, right? And they were very familiar. Now, when they looked at, does this dog look familiar? It looks like an Indian street dog, right? These are the kind of dogs that you see on our streets. And even the people looked a bit like Indians, you know, Indian tribals. That was the look. So the fury that came up is that these people have walked from India, and they could have, because the oldest remains they found in Australia of humans are about 50,000 years old. And at that time, because of the ice age, the water levels were much lower, so you could more or less walk to Australia from Africa, except there was a last stretch of about 100 kilometers, which would have to be crossed by rafts or boats or whatever. So they thought, okay, these people have clearly come from India, and the dogs must have also come from India because they knew India, they knew the dogs. Now, recently, with genetic um, technology extending so much, they did an analysis on the dingo, and they found that all the dingoes have descended from a single female who lived only 5,000 years ago. So that is a mystery, because 5,000 years ago, Australia was surrounded on all sides with thousands of kilometers of ocean. How did this pregnant dog get to Australia? And obviously then her offspring overran, because this kind of mammal is typically superior to the marsupial in terms of ability to survive and attack and all that. Now, 5,000 years ago, so people are speculating, and maybe one of you later can actually take out what is the answer to this. But there is a speculation that 5,000 years ago, we had the Indus Valley civilization in India, right? Indus Valley civilization had boats, small ones, which they just used to go along the coast to, trade in Babylon and the Iraq and Arabia area. Certainly not good enough to navigate to an unknown Australia, but it is possible that there may have been a storm, there may have been some people and a dog which could have been blown off to Australia and crash landed. That's pure speculation. What we do know is that a dog reached there 5,000 years ago. So this is a mystery to be solved. Now, can 4-5 people raise your hands? Which is your favorite variety of dog? Kids, yeah? Speak, see? I heard a Chihuahua. Yeah, louder, huh? German Shepherd, which is from Germany. Chihuahuas are from, Alsatians are from Alsace, which is now part of France, but Germany, yeah? Labrador. I think Labradors are British. So have you noticed that all these dog breeds, they're all from other countries, right? They're foreign dog breeds. We don't talk about Indian dogs. We do now have a little bit of a concept of Indies, but they're not the prized variety. But in ancient times, Indian dogs were highly prized by many countries, and they were prized for their fighting qualities. So in Jungle Book, you have these wild dogs, right, which are willing to attack everything and any animal. Can we change the slide? This is a medieval European drawing, and there used to be all these rumors about Indian dogs who will fight elephants and lions. So these people didn't know Indian dogs, they didn't know elephants either. So they have made this drawing, but just to illustrate that this is the image they had of Indian dogs. So, Persia had the first empire about 2,500 years ago. And they had conquered a part of India, Cyrus the Great and Darius. They had conquered the west coast of the Indus. So, what is Gandhar and Sindh had been conquered by Persia. And while they had Indian troops, they also used to keep hundreds of Indian dogs. The Persian emperor would keep hundreds of Indian dogs, and he had dedicated 4 villages' revenue for the upkeep of these dogs. And the Persians invaded Greece in 480 BC. So there's this very famous Greek historian called Herodotus, who's considered the father of history. He has described the troops. So since the Persians had an empire, they had troops from all over their empire. So they also had Indian troops. So the Indians who were invading Greece with the Persians in 480 BC, he's described them that they were wearing white cotton clothes. They had bamboo shields, and they had cane arrows, and there were also hundreds of Indian dogs. which came with the Persian troops. Which, well, I think normally which have evolved in India and have been there for a long time. Mongrel is mixed. Actually, I don't want to say this, but we are all mongrels, right? But so it's not, all of us have mixed origins. Um, so, um, so these dogs were not just there as guard dogs, they were trained for war. So they were trained to attack. And one of the most recent thing, one of the most recent uses we've had of dogs being used for war was in 1800. You had something called the Poligar Wars in Tamil Nadu, which was like a precursor to the mutiny, to the 1857 War of Independence, where so these zamindars, the Palayakkars or Polygars as the British call them, rose up against the British and they fought. And they had this breed of dog called the Rajapalayam, which is still there. Rajapalayam dogs are still there. They had been trained to actually attack the knees of the British cavalry horses. So in India, the dogs, it was a very unusual use of dogs, but they were used for war. Now I want to talk about another very Indian animal or bird. How many of you know that all the chicken that we eat in the world have descended from the Indian wildfowl, Gallus gallus? So I had read that somewhere and I thought, okay, so it evolved here, then it sort of flew or walked its way to the rest of the world. But that's not how the chicken actually reached the rest of the world. The Indus Valley people used to export the chicken, you know, live chicken as well as. So they would export them to Babylonia, where it was known as the royal bird of Meluha. And then from there it went to Egypt, and from there to Rome, and then to the rest of Europe. And it went up the Silk Road to China with Indian merchants. And that's how the chicken reached China. And you know, how many of you know where Lothal is? It's in Gujarat, right? It's an ancient Indus Valley Harappan site in Gujarat. So it used to be a port. So next to the port, they have found a building with a very large number of chicken bones. So we are speculating whether it was a restaurant or whether it was a chicken achar factory for export. I think I'd go for the chicken achar factory since it was right next to the port. But this is something else about Indian animals and how anywhere in the world, if you eat chicken, you know that it has come from India originally. Now I'm going to tell you another story about a very, very Indian animal. So in the 700s, Muhammad bin Qasim had conquered Sindh, right, which was part of India. And because of that, Sindh became part of this Arabic empire, which stretched from there till the Mediterranean. So at that point, they used to be fighting, the Arabs were fighting the Roman Byzantinians on the northern border of Syria, southern border of Turkey. That region was like the border, and continuously they were fighting for many, many decades. As a result of that, the people in the villages there, they all left. You know, nobody wants to live in a war zone. And over time, lions, which were endemic to that area, came and started living in those villages, and there was basically a lion menace created. After a while, the border moved northwards, okay? The Arabs conquered more of that area. And the king then the caliph, he wanted to settle people back in that area because then they'd farm, they'd give him tax, right? But since there were lions, nobody wanted to go and live in that area because you had so many lions there. So when they were discussing this problem, the Arabs who were familiar with India said that we have an animal which is there in India, which lions will not attack, but which is also extremely useful for humans. So why don't we send some of those animals there? Any guesses what animal I could be talking about? Very, very Indian. Elephant is a good guess, but no, not the elephant. No, yeah, no, we've already talked. Okay, so please change the slide. The bhesa, the water buffalo. So this is what happened. The caliph then sent 4,000 buffaloes who walked from Sindh till Syria, and they were settled there along with thousands of Indians, because they said these are good farmers and somebody needs to take care of these buffaloes as well. Who This is there in Arabic histories like Al Biladuri. We don't talk about it here, but it's there in a couple of Arabic histories. Um, Along with a few thousand people who are called Zats by the Arabs or Jats. And they were settled in northern Syria, and they got rid of the lion menace. The buffaloes are still there, or their descendants, in northern Syria. If you Google it, you'll see articles like how bombing is destroying the buffaloes. Um, Buffaloes are very hardy. They give very good quality milk, high fat milk. So they became very prized. And a few years later, the king of that region presented 500 buffaloes to the king of northern Italy. So you started having buffaloes in northern Italy, and their milk is used for a particular kind of cheese, which all of you eat. Any guesses? No, a cheese from northern Italy, which is particularly used for pizza, mozzarella, right? So this is in a way the origin story for mozzarella. And it's interesting that now most of these buffaloes are looked after by Punjabi migrants, Sikh migrants who went about 100 years ago. So their ancestors got them there, and now they are looking after those buffaloes. The Jats, the Indians who were there, the story is that they wandered into Byzantium or Constantinople today, and from there they wandered into Europe. But they maintained their Indianness. I mean, they maintained their distinct identity. You know how Indians are, na? You'll go, you still want to eat your Indian food and talk your Indian language wherever you are. So they did that. Any guesses? They're still there. Any guesses what group of people I'm talking about? Still in Europe? No, in Europe. So this is the origin story for the gypsies. When you analyze the Romani or the Gypsy language, it's clearly a North Indian language. Their counting is ek, duj, trin, and they use words like churi, nak, kan. And now they've even done a genetic analysis. So there is a particular mutation which is found on the Y chromosome of about 40% of Indian men. So we got it tested, even my father has it. It's called the Indian marker. And outside India, and it is supposed, that mutation is supposed to have taken place in India 40,000 years ago. So they found that marker in the gypsies. So they are outside India, it's there in the gypsies and in a little bit in Cambodian aristocracy. And their foundation myth is also that people came from India and married the women and founded the first Cambodian kingdom. But now with modern technology, you can actually trace these things and verify how true these oral myths are. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about another favorite animal. So how many of you, who was the greatest Mughal emperor? Akbar, right? Akbar had a fetish about, he was very fond of animals. He was very fond of dogs, which was unusual. He could not read or write because it's now considered he was dyslexic. But he had a tremendous memory. And he used to give names to everything and everybody. His gun would have a name. His gun was called Sangram. Everybody would have a pet name. All his pets would have a name. But he was particularly obsessed with one kind of cat. Any guesses? No, no. Cheetahs, right? Cheetahs, can we change the slide? Yeah. So cheetahs have been always used in India for hunting. So I used to think it's a Mughal thing. Mughals always use cheetahs for hunting. It's there in miniatures. But I was recently reading the Prithviraj Raso. And in that the poet has written that Prithviraj goes out hunting with 100 cheetahs and 1,000 dogs. So it might be an exaggeration. We are very fond of zeros. We invented it. We like to use as many of them as possible. But so Akbar, take a guess how many cheetahs Akbar owned in his lifetime. He owned 9,000 cheetahs in his lifetime. You know, when he was a teenager, when he was about 13, Humayun came back to India, and in one of the battles, they captured a pet cheetah of one of the opponents, which was given to him as a boy. Okay, you know, here's a pet for you. And he became obsessed. So he set so many traps for cheetahs across the country, and they would be captured, they would be used for hunting. You know, why cheetahs are used for hunting is, let's say a normal deer will run at 50, 60 kilometers an hour, so a dog can catch them. But in India, you have antelopes, especially the black buck, which can run at 70, 80 kilometers an hour, and no dog can catch them. But cheetahs can run at 100 plus kilometers. So that's why you would use cheetahs for hunting, because they were faster than the other animals which were there. Now, he was, you know, he was a great organizer. He set up the structures and all of the Mughal kingdom. He even structured his cheetah army, so to say. There were groups of 10, then each person had a handler and a trainer. Then you would have a head for a group of 10. They would be in these missiles and jathas and things like that. And he used to have 50 favorite cheetahs. And some of the really favorites like Madan Kali and Chitranjan would have a drummer who would walk in front of him announcing that he's coming. They would be, so all of you like to dress up your dogs, right? You like to make ponytails and put clips and make them wear sweaters. Akbar also liked to do that, and he was the richest man in the world, so he could do exactly what he liked. So these cheetahs used to have gold chains. They'd have this kamkhwab ke throws. They'd have these zarika chashmas. By chashmas, not specs, but you know, blinkers, which like horses would wear. Try and imagine the most blinged up shadi ka ghoda you've seen, and put that on a cheetah. The really important ones wouldn't even walk. When they went hunting, either they'd be carried by two men on a dolly, or they'd be put on a sling in between two horses, or some of them would even get to ride an elephant if they were, you know, favorites enough. So, so this is Akbar and the cheetahs. Now his son Jahangir, all his life, he kept trying to outdo his father in anything, which was very difficult because, you know, Akbar was, you know, he was a demon in terms of energy and he could do a lot of stuff. But and Jahangir inherited all his cheetahs, but he decided, I need to go one up and have an even more. Achha, by the way, Akbar's cheetahs used to roam around in the court, just like that. So can you imagine a job description where you have to go to court and suddenly you're surrounded by all these animals? Now, can we change the slide? Jahangir, that's a Mughal miniature of his, decided to have tame lions roaming around his court. Lions are bigger and more difficult to tame than cheetahs. And so you have a British ambassador who was stationed in the Indian court. You have a letter by him back home saying that there are 10 or 15 lions which keep frisking about between men's legs. And the wonder is no one has been eaten up yet. I think that's a hardship posting, right? So this is something about Jahangir. I think my I have 5 minutes. Okay, I'll talk about another animal quickly then, uh, which is the most Indian of animals. What is the yeah, peacock? Yes, peacock is one of them. Cows also, right? That's a bad question. But elephants, because normally even now when you write about India, you will talk about the Indian elephant, even the Indian economy or things like that. An elephant is something distinctly, and in India is the first place where the elephants were tamed. So you had elephants in Africa, but they have not been tamed. Indian elephants have been tamed, and then of course Cambodia and Southeast Asia, they tamed the elephants. We don't know whether it's because the Indian elephants are cleverer or Indians are cleverer or both or either. Anyway, so can we have the next one? Yeah. So India was always associated with the elephant. This is a Greek, this is a coin of a Greek king called Demetrius. I think all of you know that Alexander came to India and went back, and basically you had the Mauryan Empire after that. But descendants of the Greek general Seleucus used to rule over most of Asia for hundreds of years after that. And after the fall of the Mauryan Empire, many of his descendants came into India, and actually a lot of northern India was ruled by the Greeks for at least 200 years, which is a part of Indian history we are not normally taught. So this is one of the first of them who had come in. He was called Demetrius, and he got a coin struck with an elephant head. The elephant always meant India. So this shows that he kind of conquered India. Now, um, um, when Chandragupta Maurya fought with Seleucus, and they did a treaty. So Chandragupta Maurya got Afghanistan and part of Central Asia as his part of the treaty, and in return he gave five very clever kids, I must say. Who taught you this in school? Very nice. So 500 elephants. What did Seleucus do with them? He sent them off. So it's not just the elephants. They would have been the Mahavats and their families, right? Because an elephant is only going to listen to his particular Mahavat. So they were all sent off to Syria again. We seem to send a lot of animals there. And they fought the other generals. And there's a particular, you can Google it later, there's a battle of Ipsos, which Seleucus fought and won, which the elephants were a major, weapon and tool for him. Elephants were always part of Indian warfare. And not only that, the Mughals used to, in ancient India, as part of the entertainment, people would make animals fight. So it's very cruel, it's not nice, and we don't do it today. But that used to be a very common, to make roosters fight, or rams, or titar, bater, whatever animals and birds, you would make them fight. Can we have the next slide? Yeah. So this is a Mughal miniature. Only the emperors were allowed to make elephants fight. And it was an extremely dangerous sport for the Mahavats as well as for the spectators. Because if the elephant went rogue, it could just go out and stampede and kill a lot of animals. So imagine you're going to watch, say, a cricket match. Instead of that, you're going to watch an elephant match. And then you say goodbye to your family saying, I don't know whether I'm going to come back again. But I need to watch this match in any case. So they used to have, and there is a very famous story about Akbar. So can we have the next? So Akbar was like this adventure junkie. As a teenager, and since he was king, people could just kind of say, please don't do it, but then he'd do it anyway. He would like to, these captured cheetahs, he would like to try and tame them himself or try and tame wild elephants. So one morning, he decided, I'm going to be the Mahavat in an elephant match. And, people just said it's a really high-risk thing, but he wouldn't listen. And then his elephant went into a rage during the match. It was called Run Baka. And then he actually ran out into the city of Agra, killing people. And those days, Mughals didn't have bridges. They used to have these things called bridge of boats. So you would have boats tied to each other, and then you'd put planks on them, and that's how you would cross. So this bridge of boats, the elephant ran over the bridge of boats. People were jumping into the Yamuna trying to save their lives. But uh, so Akbar somehow survived. If he had not survived, you would have had a very different history of India, right? Because he is basically the person who established the Mughal Empire. So I think I've spoken a lot about many of the Indian animals. So this is just to give you an illustration. We have some of these kind of stories in our books. But Indian history is great fun. It's a mine of treasures. And I would encourage you all to read as much. I have a website, History of India for Children. So we keep putting up blogs and new articles. Please do visit it for and quizzes. So thank you.
You shared were such interesting snippets of animals in Indian history. Hopefully, they're going to go back and read your book and write to you, maybe. Thank you so much, Archana. Without any further ado, we'll request the next author to come on stage, Neha Hiranandani. She is a writer whose columns have appeared in the Indian Express, Huffington Post, NDTV, and Vogue, amongst others. She holds degrees in literature and education from Wellesley College and Harvard University. Her first book, Girl Power, was published by Scholastic India, and a forthcoming book will be published by Penguin Random House in 2020. Welcome, Neha.
Wonderful to be here. I just arrived this morning. Can you hear me? I just arrived this morning in Kolkata and absolutely taken by the wonderful weather and this wonderful venue. So it's great to be in your city. I want to talk to you about a book that I've written. It's a new book. It came out a few months ago. The title is Girl Power, and I see a lot of boys in the audience. Don't worry, it's also for you, and we'll talk about why. But before I start talking, I want to show you a short video that will tell you a little bit. I will give you a little teaser about this book, okay? So let's try and see if we can get the... There you go. Do we have audio? Can we turn up the audio, please? Okay, I think they're trying to get the audio. Any chance we can get the audio? Okay, since we're not getting the audio, let me pause this. Okay, we're almost done. Okay, great. Oh, sorry. Okay. So, now, the title of the book is Girl Power. And, but let me tell you a little bit about what it's about. So I think I've known some people from Kolkata over the years. And here's what I know about folks from Kolkata, right? I think you're bright. I think you're motivated. I think you're smart, curious. And I think you like to break the rules, right? Yes, some of us, sometimes. But, what kind of rules are we talking about? We're not talking about, we're talking about rules that sort of are perhaps unfair, perhaps dogmatic. Keep one section of society down while uplifting another. Those are the kind of rules that we're talking about. And the reason that I want to talk to you about breaking rules is because that's what a lot of the women in Girl Power did. A lot of them were up against, they broke stereotypes, they broke rules, and a lot of them were up against terrific odds, really, really terrific odds, sort of stifling poverty, literacy issues, and they overcame all of that. So I'm thinking about a woman named Subhasini Mistry, for instance. That's Subhasini on the screen. And her story is pretty incredible. She actually grew up in a village not far from here. She's Bengali. She grew up in a village not far from here. But the issue was that in her village, there was no access to healthcare. There was not a single hospital. Subhasini didn't let that stop her. She worked for 25 years as she sold vegetables. She worked as a maid. She collected coal from dumps. And she saved for 25 years to build her village's first hospital. She's treated over 250,000 people, most of them for free, and she's even won the Padma Shri for healthcare. Right? So those were the kind of odds that women like her were up against. And they fought. I'm thinking of another woman, Arunima Sinha, also in the book. Arunima, let me see if I can get an illustration up for you about Arunima. I'm not sure why this isn't working. Maybe someone can come up here and just see if they can help me with the clicker. But Arunima was, that's Arunima. She had, okay, guys, forget about that. Let's just do this. So Arunima, you saw her for a second. She had a steel leg, a steel rod in one leg and an amputated leg for the other. She was lying in a hospital bed, one leg cut off, a steel rod in the other. And she says, okay, what's the hardest thing that I can do right now? And you know what it is? You know what she decides to do? She decides to climb Mount Everest. Yeah, there you go. You know that. Yeah, she decides to climb Mount Everest. She becomes the first female amputee in the world to do that. So those are the kind of women that we've profiled in the book. And I was thinking about this a little earlier on, and I said, okay, we've got 50 women in this book, right? We've got 50 women in this book. And if I had to think about 4 rules that those 50 women, stay with me, the 4 rules that those 50 women followed to then break the other rules, here's what those 4 rules would be, right? Rule number 1. It sounds easy, but it's sort of hard to do. Rule number 1 is this: you do you, which basically means be yourself. I know it sounds easy, but sometimes it can be a little difficult. Let me try and sort of give you an example. Does anyone know what the population of the world is? Smart students. Right, 7.7 billion, right? So there's all these billions and billions of people in the world. But in all of those billions of people, if you think about it, there's only one you, right? There's only one you with your face, your smile, your laughter. So why bother trying to be like someone else? Why try to sort of, ape what someone else is doing when you can just be yourself, right? Does anyone here collect anything? Is anyone a collector of some sort? Stamps, coins, anything? What do you collect? Foreign currency. What do you collect? You collect stamps. What do you collect? Ice cream sticks. Cool. Okay. So right, we've got a plethora of folks who collect, right? We've got stamps, we've got currency, and we've got ice cream sticks. But if you speak to any of those collectors, I think the one thing that those 3 collectors will tell you is if you ask them, hey, so you as collectors, what are you guys looking for really? I think they'll all turn around and tell you, you know what, we're looking for that one unique thing, that rare piece, that sort of limited edition. And if you think about it, you are already that unique thing, that rare piece, that limited edition, right? Because in all of those 7.5 billion people, there's no one else like you. So rule number 1 sounds easy, but I can promise you this, it can be tricky sometimes. Rule number 1 is you do you, okay? Rule number 2, you're never too old to try something new. Let me try and explain. Anyone here play an instrument? What do you play? Oh my, synthesizer. What's your name? Okay. Reggie, how long have you been playing it? For 3 years. Okay, so we've got Reggie here, and he's been playing the synthesizer. I'll come to you in a second. And he's been playing the synthesizer for 3 years. Okay, now imagine this, Reggie. Imagine that I meet you again after 60 years, okay? And Reggie is sort of doddering about. He's like 70 years old by that time. But in all of those 60 years, here's the catch. In all of those 60 years, Reggie has diligently been playing the synthesizer every single day, okay? And I meet Reggie after all of these years. back here in Kolkata in this beautiful weather, in this gorgeous venue. And I say, hey, Reggie, we've got a concert tomorrow. Will you stop playing the synthesizer and will you play the guitar instead? Will you say yes or no? No. Oh, Reggie, I was hoping you'd say yes. You know why? Because that's the rule I wanted to illustrate. I wanted to say, look, no matter what, no matter how old you get, no matter how set in your ways you are, you're never too old to try something new. And on that note, look, guys, I don't know what's happening with my slide, so I'm just going to do it the old way, okay? I'm just going to try and show you an illustration from my book, and we'll see if that helps. This is Chandru Tomar, okay? Many of you may know her from the movie. That's right. She was also known as Revolver Dadi. For those of you who don't know her story, let me tell you a little bit. She went to a firing range with her granddaughter when she was 65, right? She had 8 grandchildren already. She was 65 years old. She was a doddering Dadi in a village in UP. And she goes to a firing range with her granddaughter. And just to give her granddaughter some company, she practices a few rounds. When that practice paper comes back, guess what? This Dadi has got a bullseye every single time. And she says, you know what? I'm going to start a new career. Everybody laughs at her, right? The neighbors are like, you're a Dadi, okay? You've got 8 grandchildren. Please go back to making rotis or whatever it is that you were doing. You can't start a new career. She doesn't listen. She doesn't have the money to buy any fancy equipment. So you know what she does? She holds up a jug of water for hours at a time so she can build her back muscles. She practices and practices. Everyone tries to stop her. Friends, family, neighbors, neighbor's dog, everyone tries to stop her, right? But she doesn't stop. She practices, and you know what? She becomes the star of the Rural Olympics. She goes on to win 30 national championships. And I have it on good authority that she can beat most of our police officers in the firing range, right? And she started her career when she was 65 years old, right? So, Reggie, hi. I hope that that you'll try and keep that in mind. And, right? And remember that you're never too old to try something new. Okay, rule number 3. Keep going. You remember when we were talking about, there's only one you, there's no one else like you in the world, your face, your hair, your eyes, there's only one you. There's only one with your dream as well, right? Well, there's one thing that I forgot to tell you. Sort of sad to say this, but it's true, so I'm going to have to. When you're out there and you're following your dream, chances are that you might fail, right? You might fail once, twice, 4, 7, 8, 10 times. But it's what you do next that really matters. And to illustrate that, I want to share one more story from the book. I don't know if I've got... See, when I want Sindhu, it's Revolver Dadi on the screen. Now never mind. But I wanted to show you Sindhu, right? Most of you are... Excellent, thank you. Oh, there, I've got my publisher back there. Thank you. So there we are. So that's Sindhu. I know most of you know her story, but I want to tell you a couple of things that you might not know. Does anyone know what time Sindhu would start practicing in the mornings? 4:30 in the morning, right? Sindhu would be at the courts practicing. Everyone knows Sindhu's story, badminton champion. Yes, everyone's heard of PV Sindhu. She used to get to the courts at 4:30 in the morning, every single morning. She would practice for 7, and those of you who are sports people and athletes in the audience, you know how hard this is. She would practice for 7 hours at a stretch. She would go through 1,000 shuttlecocks per session, and she would do this 7 days a week, 365 days a year, no holidays, no vacations, no breaks. She would just keep on going, right? She even broke her leg one day. You know what she did? She put it in a cast and went back to practice the next day, right? That was Sindhu. So she's practicing, she's working really hard because all of this is leading up to one moment in her life. Her big dream is winning the Olympics, right? She's practicing 4:30 in the morning. She's on the courts, working as hard as she can. everything is oriented towards that one moment in her life when she gets to the Olympics. So she does. It's 2016. She gets to the Olympics in Rio. She gets to the final of the Olympics. And in the final moments of that final match, she's playing a woman named Carolina. Sindhu loses, right? She loses. But you know what happened? When Carolina won the match, in her excitement, what she had done was her racket, she sort of threw it down on the floor, right? You know what Sindhu did? Sindhu walked over to the other side of the court, picked up that fallen racket, and placed it on Carolina's bag. I happened to meet Sindhu a few months after the Olympics, and I asked her, I said, you know, that moment, you've been training for the Olympics, you've been training for that 1 minute in your life, you've lost, you've lost. What were you thinking? Why did you walk over to the other side of the stage and pick up your opponent's racket? And you know what she said? She said, I may have lost that game, but I still had respect for myself and I still had respect for my sport. And so I wanted to keep on going. Sindhu went on, didn't stop. And does anyone remember what happened last year? 2019, she became the first Indian to become the badminton world champion, right? So that is rule number 3, guys. Keep on going. Rule number 4. Now, most of you are a bit young for this, but I can see a few folks from my generation, and we grew up listening to a song called Heal the World, right? By someone, Michael Jackson. Okay, I can see a lot of fans here. And the whole point of that song and the whole point of my rule number 4 is to say, look, we're all very lucky. We're lucky to be going to great schools, to have great families that support us and love us. And it's easy for us to try to do something for ourselves, right? That would be the easy thing to do. But what if we were to go beyond that a little bit? And what if we were to try and do something for someone else? Perhaps someone who can't do it for themselves. So my rule number 4, heal the world. I want to tell you Geeta's story. There we are. Thank you. That's Geeta. Geeta Sheshamani. And the bear that you're seeing with her, his name is Raju. So this is a really happy happy illustration, but life wasn't always this happy. Let me tell you what happened with Geeta. And this is going to be a bit graphic, so just stay with me, okay? Geeta was driving down the highway between Delhi and Agra, and she saw a bear that was being made to dance for money. And she sort of decided to investigate a little bit and try and find out what was going on there. And you know what she found? Dancing bears, or sloth bears, that's a picture of a sloth bear. Sloth bears in India used to be made to dance for money, and here's what would happen. Bear handlers, or kalandars as they were called, used to snatch the bear cub from their mother when the bear cub was just a few weeks old. They would knock out the claws, they would rip out the bear's teeth, and then through the bear's snout, they would pierce the snout with a thick needle. And then through that wound, they would put a rope. And so when the kalandar pulled on that rope, the bear would rise up in pain. And the kalandar would say, oh, look, my bear is dancing, give me money. But the bear was never dancing. The bear was simply responding to that pain of that wound in its snout. That's what Geeta discovered. What Geeta also discovered was that this had been happening in our country for 400 years. This was, a stereotype. It was a generational thing. Kalandars were inheriting these bears and this business from their fathers and their fathers before them, and it was going on like this for generations. She didn't let that stop her. She said, you know what? I don't care that it's been happening for 400 years. This needs to stop. Geeta went around and rescued 628 bears from all over India. And just imagine what that means, because she also then had to convince 628 kalandars to give up their job. And it wasn't easy, because they said, look, This is where we're getting our money, right? Why should we give you our bears? She found an alternative source of livelihood for each one of those people, rescued those bears, got them into facilities. She had to hand feed most of these bears because they were used to a lifetime of cruelty. They didn't know what kindness was. But this woman single-handedly ended a practice that had been happening in India for 400 years. You know, broke those stereotypes, said, I don't care that it's generational. This cruelty has to stop. So guys, those were my 4 rules. And I don't know if let's go over them for a second. Rule number 1, you do you. Rule number 2, Chandru's story, you're never too old to try something new, right? Rule number 3, Sindhu's story, never give up. And rule number 4, Gita's story, heal the world. So those are the kind of women that we've profiled in this book called Girl Power, which I'm so proud of. I'm so privileged to be part of this book. I hope you'll get a chance to pick up a copy. And here's what I'm fond of saying. You know, these women, they broke the rules, but I think that in breaking these rules, they built our country. Right? Thank you. I would be very happy to take questions if anyone's got any. Anyone? Go ahead. Where can you get that book? I believe there is a bookshop. It's on Amazon, it's on Flipkart, it's on every major bookstore, and I believe there's also a little bookshop that's been set up outside of the garden. So you should be able to get it everywhere. That's the book. Go on. Yeah. So the question is, what were your favorite books when you were our age? I think for me, I loved Enid Blyton. I loved absolutely everything she wrote. And because I don't want to talk only about girls, I'll tell you about a male author as well. I love Roald Dahl. Anyone else? While we wait, there we are.
Did you face any problems while writing this book?
I did. Actually, you know, for those of you who will have a chance to pick up a copy of this book, what you'll find is that each story is actually very, very short. Each story is only 300 to 400 words. So imagine you're taking, a woman who's done so much in her life, who's led a very layered, very nuanced, very detailed, very rich life, and you have to sort of condense all of that and put all of that into 300 words. I would say that was my biggest challenge in writing this book. You know, I think, so the question was, what inspired you to write the book? My daughter, who's 7 now, was reading a book called Rebel Girls. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Rebel Girls. Okay, there's a few girls here who've read it. So Rebel Girls is an incredible book that profiles cool women from all over the world. So when Zoya was reading this book, she said, you know, this is incredible, but does India only have 2 rebels? And I looked at that book, and they only had 2 women. They had Rani Lakshmibai and Mary Kom, both fantastic women, but there's so many more, right? We have so many more. So that's, and the unsung heroes, exactly. So that's where it was. It started off as organically as that, as a project between her and me, because I wanted to tell her more about the fantastic, incredible, cool, spectacular women that this country has had. Go ahead.
What encouraged you to write this book?
I think a lot of what I just said earlier, we've had so many wonderful women that have done cool things, you know, from scientists to spies, coolies, queens, athletes, singers. We've had women who've done such incredible things, but often history forgets about them. So I wanted to do my little part in reminding us that these are our women. These are, you know, our Indian women. This is our inheritance. I wanted to remind us of that. Which lady inspired me from this book? It's hard. You know, I think in some ways, I'm in love with all 50 of them. But if I had to choose one, there's an incredible story about a woman named Bula Chaudhary. Oh my God, yes, she did. She did pass. So she's exactly right. So she has been one of the first women in the world, not just in India, one of the first women in the world to swim the seas of 5 continents. So she has swum from England to France. Can you imagine? Swimming the English Channel from England to France. She swam for 13 hours from Sri Lanka to India. Imagine swimming from Sri Lanka to India. And guess what? She did all of this while she has a seawater allergy. Isn't that incredible?
Ma'am, I have a question.
Yeah.
Of the 4 rules that you have spoken, which one did you find hardest to follow?
I think the first one, the you do you. I'll tell you why, because, I think it's so easy for us to try and live someone else's dream. And, we may be trying to live our parents' dream or our teacher's dream or society's dream, but we sometimes forget what it is that makes us happy. So I've had several jobs, and I've lived all over the world. And some of them have been great sort of brand name jobs, the UN and things like that. I know we've got Shashi Tharoor coming next, so I shouldn't say much about the UN. But not all of that makes you happy. This is what made me happy. So doing what finally makes you happy, finally following your dream, I think that's hard to do, but it's worthwhile. Anyone else? Oh, yes. Sorry, there's a mic.
So this is mostly on behalf of children who want to become writers. And today there are a lot of options with traditional publishing, but also the Amazons and Ingram Spark or Tableau and all that, where you can publish on your own. So what are your thoughts on someone who wants to bring a book out? Would you advise them to go down the traditional path, which is harder, but in the end, probably a better way? But I'm old school. Or would you prefer the non-traditional?
I think the question is probably better directed to some of the fantastic publishers that are here. My publisher is somewhere in the audience. Try and find him after this. But I think for me, going with a traditional publishing house has been very rewarding because it takes a lot of the headache away from you. The sales, the distribution, all of the things that you otherwise have to do as that you would have had to do if you were self-publishing. The publishing house then takes that away from you. So I am a big fan, but I'm old school like that. So I'm a big fan of traditional publishing. With that said, I think Amish Tripathi self-publishes, and he's one of the authors that does brilliantly in India. So I suppose that works as well.
Who inspired you to write?
My publisher is here. The question is...
Who inspired you to start writing books?
Sorry. The question was, are you going to write the second part of this book? I hope so. Sorry, what was your question?
Who inspired you to
Where are
start
you?
writing books?
Sorry, where are you? Where? Oh, there you are. Sorry, hi.
Who inspired you to write starting books?
Who inspired me to start writing books? I think for most of us who are writers, or I want to say almost all of us who are writers, we're also big readers. We've grown up, we've been those kids who have brought a book to the dining table, and the parents have had to say, look, put it away, have a conversation instead. And we've been those kids with our noses in our books, right? So I think for me, my biggest inspiration has been the other great books that I've read over the years. Anybody else? Okay, thank you. So I hope you enjoyed this. Again, the book's name is Girl Power. It's been an absolute honor and a privilege to be working on this book and to be telling some of these stories. But please remember, these are not my stories. These are your stories. These are India's stories. This is our inheritance. So congratulations to all of you here, because we are in a country that has actually given us these incredible women. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Neha. And I'm sure you all inspired girls and boys alike. This was our second and last session for the Junior Kolkata Literary Meet today. We have few more sessions on 24th, and I hope all of you will come back. Thank you so much for being here. By the way, Neha's book is available at the bookstore outside. As soon as you go out of the gate, on the right, there's a bookstore by Story, our bookstore partner. You can pick up the book if you'd like to and get it signed by Neha. She's also running a writing workshop for young budding authors like you. That's tomorrow. Please inquire at the table as you are going out, and you can sign up for that. Thank you so much.